I want to begin this evening where I always begin as a historian. And I suppose this is clear from that introduction. That's with the sources. I want to start with the letters and the newspapers and the documents that make up the historical record. History is a story of people, one way or another, and people leave traces of themselves in documents. My particular passion before, during, and after writing my book has always been in exploring these primary documents. And when I teach my students about how to research, I call it the hunt. And I train them to dig and hunt for pieces of evidence. And I remind them that perhaps they'll be the first person to discover a piece of evidence, or maybe they'll be the first person to read a piece of evidence in a particular way. And it's really what I love best about being a historian. I love digging through archives in search of documents because you honestly never know what you'll find. At any rate, it's worth remembering that everything that I'm going to be talking about tonight, and indeed everything in my book as a whole and in all of my work, all of it is centered around hundreds and hundreds of private letters, private memoranda, diary entries, and newspaper essays, and I'll be mentioning a number of them as I'm chatting with you tonight. And I just think it's crucial to remember how important it is to value and preserve this actual stuff of history. Certainly, I knew from the outset of my project that the sorts of things that I was interested in exploring could only be found by immersing myself in this type of evidence, because what I really wanted to understand was what it felt like to be a national politician in the first years of the early republic when the Constitution had just taken effect. I wanted to know how politics really worked on the new national stage. I wanted to dismiss all of the assumptions that I had about political parties and Federalists and Republicans and look at the evidence with fresh eyes and hopefully recreate some part of the reality of that time that had been previously overlooked. In the end, I not only reshaped my entire understanding of how politics worked before the existence of structured parties, but I even ended up questioning my basic understanding of politics itself. Too often, we assume that politics consists of elections and congressional debate and legislation and little else. But as I discovered by trying to look through the eyes of politicians at another place and time that's very different from our own, political decisions, like any other decisions, are shaped by a culture's mindset, by the way that people think, their assumptions, their expectations, their fears and desires. So in other words, to understand the politics of a place and time, you have to understand its culture. If you don't understand how people think about their world, if you don't look through their eyes, you can never fully understand their actions and decisions, political or otherwise. And what better way to look through someone's eyes than by reading his or her personal correspondence? People reveal all sorts of things in private letters, emotions, reactions, their daily routine. There is simply nothing like a good letter to reveal personalities, passions, emotions, and expectations. So when I began this book, I began by reviewing the personal correspondence of the founders. And since I had been reading these letters literally for decades, just out of sheer interest, I had at my disposal a sort of mental database of letters. And within no time, a particular type of letter came to mind. And it's a type of letter that once I noticed it, I began to see it time and time again. And I want to show you that the kind of letter that I'm talking about, and in fact, it's one of the letters that really helped launch the entire project. And it was written by James Monroe to James Madison in 1798. As Monroe explained in the letter, President John Adams had just insulted Monroe in a public speech, and the enraged Monroe was just not quite sure how to respond. So he wrote to his friend Madison for advice, and this is how Monroe explained his options in this letter. Well, first he said ignoring Adams' insult was impossible because, as he wrote, not to notice the insult may with many leave an unfavorable impression against me. Responding personally with a challenge to a duel was also impossible, Monroe observed. I cannot, I presume, as Adams is an old man and the president. Which is just sharp thinking on the part of James Monroe. A pamphlet might serve, but Monroe had recently written one defending himself, and Adams continued to insult him. So here you literally see Monroe ticking off a list of political weapons, which includes, among other things, pamphlet writing and challenging the president to a duel. Clearly, he understood some rules of political warfare. He had a mental list of political weapons at his disposal and an understanding of the best way to deploy them. A certain kind of attack demanded a certain kind of response, and the trick was in choosing the right response. This was a key insight. And suddenly other letters came to mind, all centered around a politician trying to figure out which weapon to deploy in defending his reputation or in attacking someone else's. And as suggested by Monroe's letter, some of these weapons were rather unexpected, like challenging the president to a duel. Other letters showed politicians using nasty gossip about their enemies in really interesting and very deliberate ways that I didn't expect to see. Another unexpected weapon among America's founders, political gossip. Pamphlets, newspaper essays, even personal letters written deliberately to be shown to other people were included in this political arsenal. So this really became my task. There seemed to be a kind of personal logic to politics in the early republic, a set of rules that these national politicians were following, and no one seemed to have ever noticed it before or tried to have decoded it before. So I dubbed this unwritten rule book the Grammar of Political Combat, and I organized the book around it. Each chapter would focus on one political weapon, looking at the logic behind its use and what it revealed about the politics of the period, and there I had a book. But where to begin? Well, I decided to start by studying one of the two most unexpected political weapons, political gossip. And one supreme source immediately leapt to mind, written by Thomas Jefferson. Throughout his political career, Jefferson habitually recorded interesting dinner table conversations or small talk about his enemies on little slips of paper, which he carefully hoarded away for future use. Some people even say that sometimes at the table he would have his little notes with him and he'd be writing down what you were saying as you said it. In his old age, he took these bits of paper, he bound them together into 3 big volumes, he added some of his correspondence, and then he deposited these volumes in his papers to be discovered after his death. And he intended them to be a history of Washington's administration. He even wrote an introduction to the memos to explain exactly why they were important. And in his mind, these little bits of gossip revealed the real history of national politics. A later editor dubbed this collection of gossip the Annus, which is Latin for table talk. Well, I had seen the Annus before. It was published in the early part of this century in a volume, and many, many other historians had seen the same volume, but neither they nor I had ever focused on just what it was, a gossip log, a collection of Republican gossip about Federalists, and not surprisingly, most of it about Alexander Hamilton. Now, not only was its mere existence fascinating, but in these memoranda, you could see Jefferson himself collecting gossip, researching it, dropping it in key places with key people. Think of all the energy that Jefferson was expending on political gossip. He had cultivated it, recorded it, preserved it for decades, and then presented it to posterity as the truth. Clearly, Jefferson's Annus would be an ideal source for my study of gossip, and it revealed an entirely new political world. Some of the first things that leapt out from Jefferson's memoranda were the emotions behind them, anxiety and fear. We know the end of the story. We know that the Constitution works, the Union survives, and the nation prospers, but early national politicians knew no such thing. They believed that they were engaged in a political experiment whose outcome was entirely up for grabs. There was no telling if this experiment would work. So in their minds, their individual choices had a potentially enormous political impact. A wrong choice might bring the entire government crashing to ruin. Think of how self-conscious this must have made them about their politics. Think of their sense of responsibility. As the first national office holders under the new Constitution, everything that they did established a precedent, and there was no modern nation that they could copy for precise rules and models. National politicians were literally making it up as they went along. And foreign observers were quick to note how self-conscious American politicians seemed. As one French minister complained to Jefferson in 1789, American politicians are always as tense as a tight rope, engaged in a type of play that seems neither agreeable nor useful. Keenly aware of how weak this new national government was, national politicians were particularly worried about abiding by the rules, about maintaining order. And that same French minister who complained that American politicians were tense as a tight rope, Comte de Moustier, ran up against this concern for order in 1789 when he asked President Washington for a private meeting to discuss French-American relations. To Moustier's utter astonishment, Washington refused, explaining that he could have no such private meeting because the system was set up so that foreign affairs are to be discussed with the Secretary of State, period. Well, this just dumbfounded Moustier, who actually gave Washington a little lecture on the proper way to run a government, telling him, well, it's one thing to hold up appearances, I understand that, but everyone knows that you have to compromise behind the scenes. Moustier had run up against a second fact of early American politics, the prevailing uneasiness with backroom bargaining and secret negotiations. Among a population that was so concerned with being accountable to the body politic, and that was one of the fundamental distinctions of America's new government, politicians were accountable to the American people to an unprecedented degree. So where accountability was so important, secret negotiations and behind-the-scenes compromises seemed like a throwback to monarchical corruption and court politics. Closed-door politicking hinted at a corrupt and privileged ruling elite with something to hide. A good politician found a way to politic without appearing to politic. And what better place to conduct politics than at social events? Now, on the surface, this sounds obvious. Politicians discussed politics at dinner, but I mean more than that. Among politicians uneasy with secrecy and intrigue, dinner parties and receptions became vital political arenas, a place to negotiate, forge alliances, determine enemies, and collect and drop strategic pieces of information. Social events were public enough to avoid charges of secrecy and illicit bargaining, but private enough to permit political talk and quiet asides. They were a nebulous middle ground between public and private life that enabled politicians to preserve their principles without sacrificing their ability to politic. And foreign diplomats, again, were very quick to perceive the particular importance of dinner parties and social events in the new American Republic. As one French minister advised a countryman back home, it is after dinner here in America that one relaxes and discusses matters, and it is during the toasts that confidence and persuasion can slip in. A minister could do nothing here. Did he not often have congressmen at his dinner table? Now, the political nature of social events reveals, among other things, the political role of elite women, because women were seated at dinner tables alongside their husbands and were just as skilled at collecting or dropping, and that's actually, they're quite wonderful words for this process. They referred to collecting and dropping bits of information. Women could do this just as easily as men. And Abigail Adams, actually, was particularly skilled at this kind of politicking, and I've actually found in the Adams family papers amazing transcriptions of entire conversations. There's one case in which she was sitting next to Jefferson, not very long before the 1800 election, and she transcribed the entire conversation like a script, Mrs. A, Mr. J, Mrs. A, Mr. J, and she's very clearly just pushing at him to get him to say things he doesn't want to say, and you can just feel him squirming in this conversation. It's a wonderful document. But she would record these entire conversations and then pass these transcriptions on either to her husband or her son. Martha Washington, on the other hand, was not quite so willing to be a politician. Aware of how desperately President Washington wanted to discern public opinion of his administration, one of his secretaries suggested using his wife as a spy. As he put it, Martha Washington's serious and benevolent countenance would not suffer a person to hide a thing from her. But Martha Washington was less than thrilled at this idea, so it never quite took off. Now, this discussion of dinner table politicking brings us back to Thomas Jefferson. Because Jefferson's political modus operandi was the political dinner party. He was an absolute master at using dinners and informal chats to forge political ties and spread his worldview without ever seeming to do either. Now, this is a political method that can be, if you're doing it well at least, largely invisible. And as I've just explained, its invisibility made it ideal in the very nervous early republic, But Jefferson's contemporaries were quite aware of what he was doing, because they did it too, though somewhat less skillfully than Jefferson did. One Federalist even came up with a name for Jefferson's political technique, dubbing it Jefferson's Epicurean Artifices. Let's look more closely at one of Jefferson's dinner parties. On January 2nd, 1792, Jefferson invited Representatives Thomas Fitzsimons of Pennsylvania, Amasa Learned of Connecticut, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts to dinner, along with several other guests. After everyone but these three representatives had left, the conversation magically turned to the subject of congressional references to cabinet members for advice. Now, Jefferson and friends considered these congressional references to be the real source of Alexander Hamilton's influence and success. Congress would ask Hamilton for advice, and Hamilton was very glad to give advice, and in that way he was really basically legislating. So here we have a dinner party where the conversation has magically turned to this key crucial point. Well, the men talked for a time, and at the evening's end, Jefferson recorded in one of his memoranda that Gerry and Fitzsimons were clearly opposed to such references. 2 days later, when the House referred a question to the Secretary of the Treasury, Jefferson noted on the same slip of paper with some satisfaction, Gerry and Fitzsimons opposed it. 2 weeks later, Fitzsimons again opposed a reference to Hamilton, and Jefferson again took careful note of it on that same slip of paper. And finally, 6 weeks later, on March 7th, Republicans in Congress broached the issue in earnest, arguing that the House was capable of doing its own business without referring matters to Hamilton. After an animated debate, Hamilton's supporters prevailed. Gerry changed sides, Jefferson wrote on the bottom of that same slip of paper. His innocent dinner party was in truth a deliberate attempt to test and reinforce political supporters in the House, the start of a campaign against Hamilton's influence documented in Jefferson's detailed memorandum. Now, Jefferson was simply talking with friends, but he was also engaged in a political discussion criticizing Hamilton's influence over the legislature, a discussion aimed at encouraging three key representatives to vote along properly Republican lines. Compare Jefferson's masterfully indirect dinner with a similar dinner orchestrated by Alexander Hamilton. "I wish to have the advantage of a conversation with you," Hamilton wrote to Robert Morris in November 1790. "If you will name a day for taking a family dinner with me, I shall think it the best arrangement. The chief subjects will be additional funds for the public debt and the bank." A very different kind of a dinner party. Now, it's important to note that dinner table politicking was not reserved to Jefferson. But not everyone was as skilled at passively directing such dinners for political purposes. This was Jefferson's real forte. Even those who distrusted him found themselves drawn to him at his dinner table. New Hampshire Senator William Plummer, who greatly distrusted Jefferson, was eventually won over by such means. He has a wonderful diary among many wonderful diaries in which he describes all of this, and he describes in great detail several Jeffersonian dinner parties. And on this one occasion, Plummer observed that on Jefferson's dinner table, among the 8 different types of wine and the great variety of pies, fruit, and nuts, were 2 bottles of water from the Mississippi River and a piece of the Mammoth Cheese. Now, I have to pause here for a moment to discuss the Mammoth Cheese, which is one of my favorite silly things from the time period. The Mammoth Cheese was an enormous 1,200-pound, 4-foot-long wheel of cheese that some citizens of Massachusetts made and presented to Thomas Jefferson in honor of his inauguration in 1801. And the Mammoth Cheese was amazingly famous. Once I noticed the Mammoth Cheese, it appears everywhere. There's poetry written to the Mammoth Cheese. There's an ode to the great cheese that I've seen at the Library of Congress, complete with this very serious engraving of the big cheese. And supposedly Jefferson had public viewings of the cheese on New Year's Day every year. So there on Jefferson's table is water from the Mississippi River and a piece of the Mammoth Cheese. So in other words, the stage was literally set to woo guests with an evening of stimulating conversation focused around topics of interest: the Mississippi River, the Mammoth Cheese, topics that by chance showed Jefferson in a particularly good light. And I have to note that this dinner guest, William Plummer, ate some of the cheese in 1805. That's 4 years after Jefferson received the cheese. And he very diplomatically reported in his diary that the cheese was far from being very good. Politicians, particularly high national office holders, were not supposed to secretly politic. And in fact, on many levels, they assumed that their new experimental government would be superior to all of the old world governments that had gone before. Monarchies, they assumed, were corrupt, grounded on undue privileges and unnecessary luxury, pomp, and circumstance. America's new government would be different. As a Republican government, and I mean Republican with a small r, it would be egalitarian, public-minded, simple, and straightforward. Republican leaders were supposedly exceptional as well. A natural elite of the talented and worthy who lived modestly, dressed practically, and behaved forthrightly in a spirit of accommodation. Yet, though most public men could agree on generalities like this, concepts like simplicity or virtue or public-mindedness are relative terms, meaningful in comparison with European luxury and corruption, but lacking a specific meaning in and of themselves. How did a Republican politician dress? How much finery was too much? Should a Republican politician own a carriage? And if so, how many horses becomes monarchical? These questions may sound trivial and even ridiculous to us, but they were very real to national politicians who were self-consciously creating a style of governance and hoping to shape a new national character. Questions important enough to provoke the criticism and comments of gentlemen throughout the nation. For example, in 1789, one of President George Washington's friends congratulated him on his decision to walk in the street every day, which was deemed a very Republican act. Apparently, every day at roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington walked around the block, looked up at a clock on a church, set his watch, and walked back to his office, and he received fan mail for doing this. This was a great PR move. He seemed like a down-to-earth kind of guy for walking in the street. Well, this same friend then went on to criticize Vice President John Adams for his frequent use of a carriage and 6 horses. Gasp. Well, Washington defended Adams by reporting that no, he actually used 4 horses, not 6. 4 is much more Republican than 6. Adams, ever sarcastic, defensively remarked that, "I walk a league in the streets every day, which is more than any other member of Congress ever did, so that in this respect I am undoubtedly the man of the most merit anywhere to be found." The ambiguities of republicanism and its importance to the success or failure of America's experiment in government were thus obviously immediate and ever-present in the lives of politicians, shaping even the most seemingly trivial of decisions. For example, confusion about republicanism literally stopped Pennsylvania Senator William McClay dead in his tracks during a 1791 dinner party. And I have to pause for a moment just to mention McClay's diary because it's an amazing document. Senator McClay kept this huge 3-volume diary. Literally every day, I think there were 12 days in 3 years that he didn't write in this diary, and he recorded everything. He recorded his dreams. He recorded what other senators were snacking on while they sat in the seats next to him. Oranges were particularly popular. He wrote down the little whispers he heard people uttering on the floor. So he notes on one occasion someone near him whispered, "John Adams needs his wig dressed." So everything is in McClay's diary. And really, because he was new to the national stage and he was very nervous about being in this elevated realm, it's really an incredible eyewitness document that gives you a sense of what it felt like to be a national politician in these very dramatic early years. So in McClay's diary, he recorded an incident that really shows the everyday reality of this seemingly abstract idea of republicanism. One night, McClay went to a dinner party, and he entered the room and was immediately confronted by President Washington, which threw him into utter confusion because he revered George Washington. He considered him the nation's first man, as he put it, and he literally never knew what to do or say. He just lost his head whenever he was around George Washington. It was just too much to be in the great man's presence. So he enters the room, there's Washington, he stumbles through a bow, he's mortified that he looks very awkward, and lo and behold, across the room he sees an empty seat next to some New Englanders, and so he quickly makes his exit and heads towards this empty seat, only to see out of the corner of his eye Washington gesturing to him to please sit beside him. And this threw McClay into utter confusion. What would a good Republican do? He was dying to turn around and accept the honor, but a good Republican should not be too deferential to the president, who should not seem like a king in any way. If Washington was treated like a king, he might become a king. So assuring himself that he was acting in the nation's best interest, Maclay continued walking away from Washington. He refused the seat. He did what he considered was the sort of patriotic thing to do. And then, of course, in his diary that night, he recorded this great trauma that he had to not sit by George Washington, but that he congratulated himself that he knew it was the right thing to do. But it's a remarkable story because here you see this politician very self-consciously trying to act like a proper Republican. And in this case, it just depends on accepting a seat or not. And in his mind, not accepting that seat is for the good of the nation. National politicians were equally self-conscious about the structure of their politics, the way that they organize themselves. Now, in our minds, of course, there's a natural organization to American politics, political parties. American politics centers around organized teams of political opponents with identifiable differences of principle and policy, or at least most of the time. And to early national politicians, however, organized permanent political parties were not only not the norm, they were something to be avoided. This distrust of a permanent national two-party system was yet another distinctive aspect of early national politics. Rather than assuming that this was the normal mode of conducting politics as we do, national politicians considered a party system a violation of Republican government. To them, a party or faction was an exclusive group of men trying to benefit themselves and not the general public good. People in political parties were not independent of spirit, they thought. They were political tools. This resulted in an extremely personal form of politics that could be exceedingly confusing, because without the formal alliances offered by membership in an open party, it was often difficult, if not impossible, to tell one's friends from one's foes. There were no organized parties in this unstructured new arena, no set teams of combat. Politicians considered themselves groups of friends, and actually that's how they referred to themselves. The particular friends of Mr. Jefferson and the particular friends of Mr. Hamilton are their phrases for themselves. Alliances were unpredictable, and victory went to those who trusted the right people at the right time in the right way. This was a politics of shifting coalitions and unknown loyalties where an ally could become an opponent at the drop of a hat. In a sense, a politics without a permanent two-party system was like a war without uniforms. In this relatively unstructured political world, a man's reputation, his status, his friends and enemies, thus had great importance because they were all a means of determining his political sensibilities. The more that you knew about a man, the better you knew his reputation, the better you could predict his politics. This personal form of politics thus brings us to another distinctive feature of early national politics, the importance of the code of honor. Now, personal honor would have been important to any gentleman of this period because really it defined a man's sense of self-worth, his very identity. A man without honor would have been considered no man at all. But honor was even more important for politicians because they won or lost offices and elections based on their personal reputations above all else. Not only their sense of self, but their careers rested on their reputations and honor. In early national America, it was character and reputation that qualified you for public office, not job skills and talents. Elections went to the man with the best reputation, the man who the public most respected. So to get voted into office, to get your friends into office, or to exercise any power or influence, you needed to have the right sort of reputation. So think of the power of a character attack. If successful, it could destroy a politician's life and career in one blow. Thus the importance of the code of honor. Among men who were so touchy about their reputations, rules of behavior became very important. In the unstructured arena of national politics, they became even more important, controlling and channeling political combat by enforcing gentlemanly standards of behavior. Where insults could have such grave consequences, where the wrong word might lead to the dueling ground, there had to be clearly defined rules and standards to prevent accidental insults, duels, and deaths. The Code of Honor set out clear standards of conduct, words to avoid, actions to avoid, and when a line was crossed and honor was offended, the Code of Honor offered a regulated way of settling the dispute, hopefully with negotiations, but sometimes with gunplay on a dueling ground. For example, there were a number of what I call alarm bell words that you could never use in reference to another gentleman. Words like liar, coward, rascal, scoundrel, and my personal favorite, puppy. never call another gentleman a puppy. These were fighting words, and anyone who hurled them at an opponent was almost inviting a duel. In a sense, they were dares that virtually demanded a response. And it's remarkable when you look at the primary evidence, the hushed anticipation at the mention of any of these words in public is almost palpable in accounts of honor disputes. Faces blanch, people go still, background noise stops, and all eyes turn to the accuser and his victim, waiting to see how the moment will play out. Now, not all of these honor disputes resulted in duels, and as a matter of fact, the vast majority of them ended during negotiations. The point of an affair of honor was to demonstrate your willingness to die for your honor, not to engage in gunplay. So it was entirely possible to redeem your honor during negotiations by declaring your willingness to duel and then reaching some kind of a compromise and never reaching the dueling ground. When you realize that negotiations like this were actually ritualized affairs of honor, you discover that honor affairs were surprisingly common in the period, which brings us to the subject of my chapter on dueling, Alexander Hamilton. Now, of course, we all know about Hamilton's duel with Aaron Burr, but few people know that it was his 11th affair of honor. 10 times before, he had commenced negotiations in an honor dispute, though on those occasions, he and his opponent had agreed on some kind of an apology or an explanation, and they'd avoided any kind of a trip to the dueling ground. Although in one case, literally, it was the night before, it was hours away from the trip to the dueling ground, and at the last second, somebody thought of the right apology, and the matter was settled. In New York City alone, in the years surrounding the Burr-Hamilton duel, there were at least 17 other political duels, many of them interrelated. In other words, the Burr-Hamilton duel was not a grand exception, but instead part of a larger trend. Now, of course, Hamilton was the sort of person who attracted controversy. Not only was he the leader of a political alliance, the Federalists, but he was a man of strong opinions who was not very good at keeping his mouth shut. In Hamilton's mind, he was always right, he was always the best person for every job, and anyone who thought otherwise was a fool. He also had some real deep-seated insecurities about his status and his reputation because he'd come to power from very humble and even questionable origins. He was born in the West Indies, an illegitimate child living in relative poverty who was essentially orphaned by the age of 13. And he actually made his way to New York only with the help of charitable donations from people who knew him and wanted to help him get a real education. So he had reason to feel insecure about his status among the political elite. For all of these reasons, Hamilton was a man who became entangled in honor disputes again and again. For example, look at his behavior on an unfortunate afternoon in July of 1795 during an incident that opens the introduction to affairs of honor. Discovering ahead of time that there was going to be a big Republican rally protesting against the Jay Treaty, which many Republicans considered a complete surrender to the British, Hamilton decided to take action. The protest meeting was to start at noon, so at the stroke of 12, Hamilton mounted a stoop surrounded by a few high-ranking Federalists and tried to seize control of the meeting. He first tried to address the audience, only to be silenced by what one newspaper described as hissings, coughings, and hootings. He cried out that he'd be happy to explain the treaty, line by line, only to be rebuffed by being told that the treaty had been published in the newspaper, the people could consider it for themselves, thank you very much. Finally, in utter frustration, he bellowed that the crowd had no constitutional right to give an opinion of the treaty. It's never an idea to tell a big mob that they don't have a right to be a big mob. Bad strategy. And at this point, of course, the crowd broke into an uproar. And suddenly, someone threw a rock, striking Hamilton in the head. Calling for the friends of order to follow him, Hamilton stormed off, humiliated and defeated. He soon encountered a loud public argument out on the sidewalk between a Federalist and a Republican. Trying to break it up, he was dismissed by the Republican who said something like, "Why do I need to listen to you?" More mortification, which drove Hamilton to immediately challenge the man to a duel, right on the spot. Seething, Hamilton continued down the street only to encounter another argument, which drove him into an absolute passion, during which eyewitnesses said he waved his fist in the air and offered to fight the whole detestable faction one by one, at which point a Republican stepped forward to accept the challenge, offering to meet Hamilton with pistols in half an hour where he pleased. explaining that he already had one duel pending. Hamilton swore that when that one was settled, this second adversary would get his due. So here we have literally 2 duel challenges within hours. Mortified by the public slap at his status during the rally, Hamilton turned to the code of honor to reaffirm his membership among the ruling elite, a pattern that was all too common. In fact, close study of Hamilton's many honor disputes, along with many, many other honor disputes of the time, reveals a remarkable fact about political duels that really surprised me in the process of writing this book. Political duels were often deliberately provoked, often right after an election. Today we have this idea, I guess largely the result of movies, that duels were caused by a slip of the tongue and a slap on the cheek, and then presto, you've got a duel. But in fact, in early national politics, most of the time, the loser of an election, or one of his friends, would provoke the winner of the election, or one of the winner's friends, into a duel. So in other words, political duels were like counter-elections. A person who was dishonored by a democratic electoral contest tried to redeem his reputation with an aristocratic contest of honor, a duel. In essence, political duels were well-planned political messages. They were deliberate attempts to redeem an electoral loss and prove oneself eligible for future leadership. This understanding of political dueling casts the Burr-Hamilton duel in an entirely new light. In 1804, Aaron Burr's political career was in trouble. Vice president under Jefferson, he was entirely distrusted by Jefferson and then cast aside after Jefferson's first term. Turning to his home state of New York, Burr decided to run for governor, only to lose, helped along by Hamilton's active opposition. It was a humiliating loss. First, Burr had been ousted from the vice presidency. Now he'd been publicly declared not good enough to be governor. Not surprisingly, he began to feel desperate to prove himself a deserving political leader, and especially to his supporters who were beginning to doubt him. Why cling to Burr as a leader if he could offer no patronage, no power, no influence? And some of his supporters actually said this quite literally. As one of them put it, Burr had to fight back. If he tamely sat down in silence, what must have been the feelings of his friends? They must have considered him as a man not possessing sufficient firmness to defend his own character, and consequently unworthy of their support. So to prove himself a political leader, Burr had to redeem his reputation. And he was in this frame of mind when a friend put a newspaper clipping in his hand that suggested that Hamilton had said, quote, something despicable about Burr. Now it's important to note at this point that Burr was not thinking, I need to slaughter Hamilton. Rather, he was thinking, I've been humiliated, my political career is dying, I have to prove my worth, and now here in my hand is authentic evidence of someone attacking my honor. Better yet, evidence of Hamilton attacking me, someone who's been attacking me for 15 years. For Burr, defending his honor felt necessary at this point. It made sense. Hamilton's specific insult made little difference. Burr just needed a way to redeem his reputation. And here is the answer to one mystery that surrounds the Burr-Hamilton duel. What was the mysterious, despicable thing that Hamilton said that caused Burr to challenge him? People have come up with all sorts of alternatives, the most popular one being that Hamilton accused Burr of incest, of sleeping with his daughter. That actually comes from Gore Vidal. But people love that theory. But the fact is, as with many deliberately provoked duels, the precise insult was less important than Burr's chance to redeem his honor. There was no specific insult, and this ends up being a problem in the course of the duel. There was a general insult that Burr seized upon to clear his name. So Burr sent Hamilton a ritualized letter inquiring about Hamilton's alleged insult and demanding a response. Well, here was a clear threat. When you receive one of these sort of ritualized letters, you know you're in trouble. This is the beginning of an affair of honor. But Hamilton was puzzled. Burr said only that Hamilton had uttered something despicable about him. But how could Hamilton explain or defend something that was so vague? Hamilton's unfortunate response to Burr's letter reveals how torn Hamilton was between his need to face Burr's challenge and his desire to avoid it. Trying desperately to find a way out of his predicament, he began his letter with a long, tortured argument about the meaning of the word despicable, asking essentially, well, what does despicable mean between gentlemen anyway? To Burr, This argument sounded like an evasive, insulting grammar lesson. He actually scolded Hamilton about lecturing him on syntax when he should be thinking about more serious things. Hamilton then concluded his letter with a burst of bluster to show that he was not afraid to duel if he had to prove that he wasn't a coward. He wrote that he would not be held responsible for hearsay and that he was willing to face the consequences for his actions, a statement that to Burr seemed like an arrogant dare. Needless to say, Burr's response to Hamilton's letter was quick and sharp. He said that the letter revealed, quote, nothing of that sincerity and delicacy which you profess to value. In other words, Hamilton was not acting like a gentleman, a highly offensive insult that Hamilton could not ignore. So now Hamilton felt insulted and could not back down, and Burr felt insulted and more insistent on fighting. And you can begin to see how things really spiraled down from this point. Although Hamilton eventually offered something of an explanation, stating that his insult was not intended to be personal, which is kind of a tough argument to make on Hamilton's part after 15 years of attacking Burr, Burr was so insulted by that point that he felt that nothing but a trip to the dueling ground could redeem his honor. So he did what any grievously dishonored gentleman would have done. He demanded an apology that was so humiliating that it would force Hamilton to fight. He insisted that Hamilton apologize for anything that he had said that was derogatory to Burr's private character from throughout their entire 15-year rivalry. And as Burr expected, Hamilton refused that apology, and Burr then formally challenged him to a duel, a challenge which Hamilton accepted. Now, Hamilton later explained his actions in a final statement written the night before the duel to be made public only in the event of his death. And it's actually, this document is the focus of the chapter on dueling and affairs of honor. It's also yet another document that everyone knew about. It's not as though it was a mystery or lost to historians, but no one appears to have ever read it very closely. They just said, oh yeah, here's Hamilton's final statement next. And I think, as far as I can tell, didn't really look to see what Hamilton was saying, very specifically. What was the emotion behind it? What was he trying to get across? In the statement, he acknowledged all of the reasons why he didn't want to duel: his family, his debts, his religious scruples, his simple desire to live. He explained why he felt compelled to fight. He had seriously insulted Burr over the course of their 15-year rivalry, and he believed what he had said, so he couldn't apologize, particularly since Burr had insulted Hamilton during their negotiations. But most fundamental of all, he felt that, as he put it, all the considerations which constitute what men of the world denominate honor impressed on me, as I thought, a peculiar necessity not to decline the call. The ability to be in future useful in those crises of our public affairs which seem likely to happen would probably be inseparable from a conformity with public prejudice in this particular, which is a long way of saying that Hamilton expected a future political crisis, and in fact, he expected a civil war. And in his mind, if he didn't seem like a leader, if he did not defend his honor at this moment, he would be dishonored, cast off, and then useless at that ultimate moment of crisis. So in essence, Hamilton, like Burr, was dueling to prove himself a worthy political leader. People who study the Burr-Hamilton duel tend to blame it on irrational emotion, claiming that Burr was a murderous fiend out to kill Hamilton, and that Hamilton was depressed and had a death wish, in effect that he was committing suicide by duel. But the two men's decisions were not irrational or purely emotional. They resulted from a reasoned course of logic. It was another one of the questions when I started this book that really intrigued me. This seems like the ultimate illogical thing to fight a duel, but hundreds of people reasoned their way into it. So I really wanted to understand, how could this make sense to all of these people that they needed to duel? It can't be irrational emotion in every case, and obviously it wasn't. There is a logic to it. So to understand the political importance of honor and reputation is thus to understand something of the emotional reality of being a national politician during America's founding. It's impossible to fully understand elite politics in this period without looking through a lens of honor. The knee-jerk sense of panic, the rampant suspicions, the high passions and shrill accusations were not irrational. They were a natural product of a politics of reputation that blended personal identity, public office, and political experimentation in a dangerous brew. Politicians were learning how to conduct national politics one decision at a time. Now, of course, logical decisions can be bad decisions. One can make rational choices for all the wrong reasons or reason one's way into the wrong path. Honor-bound politicians were not always honorable. And this is precisely the point. Too often, the founders are praised to the skies as saintly deities of governance or condemned as self-interested elitists who cared for money and power above all else. In reality, they were something of both. They sincerely wanted to create a great nation grounded on popular will and the rights of man. They were also obsessively concerned with their interests, careers, reputations, and pocketbooks, practicing down and dirty politics in their efforts to get ahead. And this is a distinction that makes a difference. If the founding generation were a band of angels, then American politics has been in a state of free fall ever since. If they were little more than greedy power mongers, there's little hope that America can rise to much more. But as real people who struggled with a difficult task, sometimes inspired to high purpose, other times feeding their meanest appetites, they extend to posterity the gift of hope. If these fallible, very human people could accomplish great things, perhaps future generations can do so as well. It's the logic that inspired their greatest hopes for the future, the ultimate message that they hope to impart. Thank you very much.